Sections 65 and 66 of 100%, The Story of a Patriot, by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 65. With these reflections, Peter went back to the American House, where McGivney had promised to meet him that evening. Peter went to room 427, and being tired after the previous night's excitement, he lay down and fell fast asleep. And when again he opened his eyes, he wasn't sure whether it was a nightmare, or whether he had died in his sleep and gone to hell with Mr. God. Somebody was shaking him and bidding him in a gruff voice, "Wake up!" Peter opened his eyes, and saw that it was McGivney, and that was all right. It was natural that McGivney should be waking him up. But what was this? McGivney's voice was angry. McGivney's face was dark and glowering, and, most incredible circumstance of all, McGivney had a revolver in his hand and was pointing it into Peter's face. It really made it much harder for Peter to get awake, because he couldn't believe that he was awake. Also, it made it harder for McGivney to get any sense out of him, because his jaw hung down, and he stared with terrified eyes into the muzzle of the revolver. My God, Mr. McGivney, what's the matter?" "Get up here," hissed the rat-faced man, and he added a vile name. He gripped Peter by the lapel of his coat and half jerked him to his feet, still keeping the muzzle of the revolver in Peter's face. And poor Peter, trying desperately to get his wits together, thought of half a dozen wild guesses, one after another. Could it be that McGivney had heard him denouncing Mr. God and proclaiming himself a Red? Could it be that some of the Reds had framed up something on Peter? Could it be that McGivney had gone just plain crazy, that Peter was in the room with a maniac armed with a revolver? "Where did you put that money I gave you the other day?" demanded McGivney, and added some more vile names. Instantly, of course, Peter was on the defensive. No matter how frightened he might be, Peter would never fail to hang on to his money. I spent it, Mr. McGivney." "You're lying to me." "No." "Tell me where you put that money," insisted the man, and his face was ugly with anger, and the muzzle of the revolver seemed to be trembling with anger. Peter started to insist that he had spent every cent. "Make him cough it up, Hammett," said McGivney, and Peter for the first time realized that there was another man in the room. His eyes had been so fascinated by the muzzle of the revolver that he hadn't taken a glance about. Hammett was a big fellow, and he strode up to Peter and grabbed one of Peter's arms, and twisted it around behind Peter's back and up between Peter's shoulders. When Peter started to scream, Hammett clapped his other hand over his mouth, and so Peter knew that it was all up. He could not hold on to money at that cost. When McGivney asked him, "Will you tell me where it is?" Peter nodded, and tried to answer through his nose. So Hammett took his hand from his mouth. "Where is it?" And Peter replied, "In my right shoe." Hammett unlaced the shoe and took it off, and pulled out the inside sole. And underneath was a little flat package wrapped in tissue paper, and inside the tissue paper was the $1,000 that McGivney had given Peter, and also the $300 which Peter had saved from Nelse Ackerman's present, and $200 which he had saved from his salary. Hammett counted the money, and McGivney stuck it into his pocket, and then he commanded Peter to put on his shoe again. Peter obeyed with his trembling fingers, meantime keeping his eye in part on the revolver and in part on the face of the rat. "What's the matter, Mr. McGivney?" "You'll find out in time," was the answer. "Now you march downstairs, and remember, I've got this gun on you, and there's 8 bullets in it, and if you move a finger I'll put them all into you." So Peter and McGivney and Hammett went down in the elevator of the hotel, and out of doors, and into an automobile. Hammett drove, and Peter sat in the rear seat with McGivney, who had the revolver in his coat pocket, his finger always on the trigger, and the muzzle always pointed into Peter's middle. So Peter obeyed all orders promptly, and stopped asking questions, because he found he could get no answers. Meantime, he was using his terrified wits on the problem. The best guess he could make was that Guffey had decided to believe Joe Angel's story instead of Peter's. But then, why all this gunplay, this movie stuff? Peter gave up in despair, and it was just as well, for what had happened lay entirely beyond the guessing power of Peter's mind or any other mind. Section 66. They went to the office of the Secret Service Department of the Traction Trust, a place where Peter had never been allowed to come hitherto. It was on the 14th floor of the Merchants' Trust Building, and the sign on the door read, "The American City Land and Investment Company. Walk in." When you walked in, you saw a conventional real estate office, and it was only when you had penetrated several doors that you came to the secret rooms where Guffey and his staff conducted the espionage work of the big business interests of the city. Peter was hustled into one of these rooms, and there stood Guffey, and the instant Guffey saw him, he bore down upon him shaking his fist. "You dirty stinking puppy!" he exclaimed. "You miserable little whelp! You dirty sneaking hound!" He added a number of other descriptive phrases taken from the vocabulary of the kennel. Peter's knees were shaking, his teeth were chattering, and he watched every motion of Guffey's angry fingers, and every grimace of Guffey's angry features. Peter had been fully prepared for the most horrible torture he had experienced yet, but gradually he realized that he wasn't going to be tortured, he was only going to be scolded and raged at, and no words could describe the wave of relief in his soul. In the course of his street rat's life, Peter had been called more names than Guffey could think of if he spent the next month trying. If all Guffey was going to do was to pace up and down the room, and shake his fist under Peter's nose every time he passed him, and compare him with every kind of domestic animal, Peter could stand it all night without a murmur. He stopped trying to find out what it was that had happened, because he saw that this only drove Guffey to fresh fits of exasperation. Guffey didn't want to talk to Peter. He didn't want to hear the sound of Peter's whining gutter pup's voice. All he wanted was to pour out his rage, and have Peter listen in abject abasement, and this Peter did. But meantime, of course, Peter's wits were working at high speed. He was trying to pick up hints as to what the devil it could mean. One thing was quite clear: the damage, whatever it was done. The jig was up, it was all over but the funeral. They had taken Peter's money to pay for the funeral, and that was all they hoped to get out of him. Gradually came other hints. "So you thought you were going into business on your own," snarled Guffey, and his fist, which was under Peter's nose, gave an upward poke that almost dislocated Peter's neck. "Aha!" thought Peter, "Nelse Ackerman has given me away." "You thought you were going to make your fortune and retire for life on your income." Yes, that was it, surely. But what could Nelse Ackerman have told that was so very bad? "You were going to have a spy of your own, set up your own bureau, and kick me out, perhaps." My God, thought Peter, who told that? Then suddenly Guffey stopped in front of him. "What was that you thought?" he demanded. He repeated the question, and it appeared that he really wanted an answer, and so Peter stammered, "No, sir." But evidently the answer didn't suit Guffey, for he grabbed Peter's nose and gave it a tweak that brought the tears into his eyes. "What was it, then?" A nasty sneer came on the head detective's face, and he laughed at Peter with a laugh of venomous contempt. "I suppose you thought she really loved you. Was that it? You thought she really loved you?" And McGivney and Hammett and Guffey ha-ha'd together, and to Peter it seemed like the mockery of demons in the undermost pit of hell. Those words brought every pillar of Peter's dream castle tumbling in ruins about his ears. Guffey had found out about Nell. Again and again on the automobile ride to Guffey's office, Peter had reminded himself of Nell's command, "Stick it out, Peter, stick it out." He had meant to stick it out in spite of everything, but now in a flash he saw that all was lost. How could he stick it out when they knew about Nell, and when Nell herself was no longer sticking it out? Guffey saw these thoughts plainly written in Peter's face, and his sneer turned into a snarl. "So you think you'll tell me the truth now, do you? Well, it happens there's nothing left to tell." Again he turned and began pacing up and down the room. The pressure of rage inside him was so great that it took still more time to work it off. But finally the head detective sat down at his desk, and opened the drawer and took out a paper. "I see you're sitting there trying to think up some new lie to tell me," said he. And Peter did not try to deny it, because any kind of denial only caused a fresh access of rage. "All right," Guffey said, "I'll read you this, and you can see just where you stand, and just how many kinds of a boob you are." So he started to read the letter, and before Peter had heard one sentence he knew this was a letter from Nell, and he knew that the castle of his dreams was flat in the dust forever. The ruins of Sargon and Nineveh were not more hopelessly flat. "Dear Mr. Guffey," read the letter. "I am sorry to throw you down, but $50,000 is a lot of money, and we all get tired of work and need a rest. This is to tell you that Ted Crothers has just broke into Nelse Ackerman's safe at his home, and we have got some Liberty bonds and some jewels, which we guess to be worth $50,000, and you know Ted is a good judge of jewels. Now of course you will find out that I was working in Mr. Ackerman's home, and you will be after me hotfoot, so I might as well tell you about it, and tell you it won't do you any good to catch us, because we have got all the inside dope on the Goober frame-up, and everything else your bureau has been pulling off in American City for the last year. You can ask Peter Gudge, and he'll tell you. It was Peter and me that fixed up that dynamite conspiracy, but you mustn't blame Peter, because he only did what I told him to do. He hasn't got sense enough to be really dangerous, and he will make you a perfectly good agent if you treat him kind and keep him away from the women. You can do that easy enough if you don't let him get any money, because of course he's nothing much on looks, and the women would never bother with him if you didn't pay him too much. Now Peter will tell you how we framed up that dynamite job, and of course you wouldn't want that to get known to the Reds, and you may be sure that if Ted and me get pinched, we'll find some way to let the Reds know all about it. If you keep quiet, we'll never say a word, and you've got a perfectly good dynamite conspiracy, with all the evidence you need to put the Reds out of business, and you can just figure it cost you $50,000, and it was cheap at the price, because Nelse Ackerman has paid a whole lot more for your work, and you never got anything half as big as this. I know you'll be mad when you read this, but think it over and keep your shirt on. I send it to you by messenger so you can get hold of Nelse Ackerman right quick, and have him not say anything to the police, because you know how it is. If those babies find it out, it will get to the Reds and the newspapers, and it'll be all over town and do a lot of harm to your frame-up. And you know, after those Reds have got beaten up and Shawn Grady lynched, you wouldn't like to have any rumor get out that that dynamite was planted by your own people. Ted and me will keep out of sight, and we won't sell the jewels for a while, and everything will be all right. Yours respectfully, Edith. P.S. It really ain't Peter's fault that he's silly about women, and he would have worked for you all right if it hadn't been for my good looks. End of sections 65 and 66.